Begin the MOVE bombing memorial route at the Municipal Services Building beside City Hall, where the city presents remembering MOVE, May 13, 1985. This is an important opening because the bombing was not only a neighborhood event. It was an exercise of municipal power, police, fire officials, elected leadership, legal orders, tactical planning, and public communication all converged on a residential block in West Philadelphia. On May 13, 1985, Philadelphia police attempted to remove MOVE from 6221 Osage Avenue. The city dropped an explosive on the house, a fire spread through the row homes, and 11 people died, including 5 children. Do not rush past the number. Name the people when the exhibit provides their names, and remember that the victims were members of a family and community, not an anonymous crowd. The Philadelphia Special Investigation Commission later found that the bombing, the gunfire, and the failure to control the fire constituted an unjustified use of excessive force. The Commission's language matters because it places responsibility on decisions and institutions rather than treating the event as an unavoidable accident. This building is therefore a difficult memorial location. It is close to the offices and procedures of government, while the exhibit asks the government and the public to face the human results of those procedures. Spend time with the photographs, testimony, maps, and chronology. Notice which facts are documented, which claims are contested, and how survivors and families have described the aftermath. The route will move west, but keep one question with you: what does accountability look like when an institution has to preserve evidence of its own violence? The next stops widen the frame to medical racism, Black historical memory, MOVE's earlier years in Powelton Village, and the community life surrounding the destroyed block. At the African American Museum in Philadelphia, pause over the question of how a city remembers harm. Founded in 1976 during the nation's bicentennial, AMP was the first institution funded and built by a major municipality to preserve, interpret, and exhibit African American heritage. That mission makes it a meaningful companion to the MOVE route. The bombing cannot be understood only through police reports or aerial photographs. It must also be placed within longer histories of Black life, medical inequality, neighborhood organizing, state violence, family memory, and the struggle to define whose testimony counts. The stop's reference to medical apartheid and healing panels points toward that wider context. Medical institutions have often presented themselves as neutral places of care while Black communities experienced unequal treatment, experimentation, neglect, and exclusion. A history of healing therefore has to include both medical achievement and the people who were harmed by medical systems. At AMP, look for the ways exhibitions use objects, images, text, and oral history to restore human scale. A museum does not make a tragedy safe or complete. It creates a public setting where people can encounter evidence, ask questions, and connect one event to structures that existed before it and continued afterward. This is especially important for MOVE, where the city has had to confront not only the bombing itself but also the handling of victims' remains, the destruction of homes, the legal aftermath, and the long struggle over public language. The city of Philadelphia's later independent investigations examined how human remains from the bombing were held and handled over decades. That history reminds us that remembrance is an ongoing responsibility, not a ceremony performed once. Use this stop to connect the MOVE story to Black Philadelphia's broader archive. Then continue to Powelton Village, where the route returns to the years before 1985 and asks how conflict accumulated. Powelton Village is the prehistory of the 1985 bombing. MOVE formed in Philadelphia in the early 1970s around John Africa and a communal philosophy centered on life, nature, opposition to institutional authority, and a rejection of many technologies and social conventions. From 1973 to 1978, members lived and organized in Powelton Village. The neighborhood became a site of escalating conflict involving residents, police, city officials, media, and MOVE members. University of Pennsylvania's West Philadelphia Collaborative History documents the central tension without pretending that one side's description is the entire story. Neighbors raised concerns about noise, sanitation, animals, and public disruption, while MOVE members understood their way of life as a political and spiritual challenge to systems they believed were destructive. That difference in interpretation matters. A route about state violence should not romanticize every action by MOVE, but neither should it allow complaints about a communal group's lifestyle to erase the scale of police power used against it. In August 1978, after months of failed negotiations, Mayor Frank Rizzo ordered a police assault on the Powelton village headquarters. A police officer was killed, MOVE homes were destroyed, and 9 MOVE members were later convicted and imprisoned. The confrontation hardened the relationship between MOVE and the city. When the organization later relocated to Osage Avenue, the earlier siege was part of the institutional memory on both sides. Stand here and imagine the neighborhood as lived space rather than a backdrop: row houses, porches, children, neighbors, meetings, police lines, reporters, and arguments about who had the right to define public order. Your task is to hold two truths together. Conflict existed, and the city's response created a pattern of escalation that made later catastrophe more likely. The route now moves toward the everyday community spaces that help us see West Philadelphia as more than the site of a single disaster. This stop at Chef Kurt's Barbecue gives the memorial route a necessary change of scale. After municipal offices, museum galleries, police action, and the remembered violence of Osage Avenue, a neighborhood restaurant brings us back to ordinary community life: food, conversation, work, hospitality, and the stories people tell while sharing a table. Do not treat this as a decorative lunch break. Community businesses are archives too, although their evidence is often oral rather than catalogued. An owner may remember who showed up, what families needed, how a neighborhood changed, which streets felt safe, and how public tragedy affected people who were never named in national headlines. Those stories do not replace official records. They add lived context to them. The MOVE bombing displaced residents, destroyed homes, and changed how West Philadelphia was represented to outsiders. A local business can reveal the continuing life of the neighborhood after cameras leave. As you stand here, pay attention to the difference between memorialization and survival. A memorial asks people to stop and remember. A restaurant asks people to keep living, to feed one another, employ neighbors, welcome visitors, and create a place where conversation can continue. That continuity is part of the history. If the owner or staff share stories, listen without turning them into spectacle. Ask what they want visitors to understand about the community, and do not assume that every local person has the same interpretation of MOVE or the bombing. The route's ethical instruction is simple: community members are not background characters in a tragedy. They are people with knowledge, agency, and their own reasons for remembering or not remembering. Carry that humility to Osage Avenue. The next stop is the physical center of the event, but this stop reminds us that West Philadelphia is a neighborhood before it is a headline. Osage Avenue is the emotional center of the route. On May 13, 1985, police surrounded the MOVE house at 6221 Osage Avenue while attempting to serve arrest warrants and remove the group from the property. The city used thousands of rounds of ammunition and dropped an explosive device onto the roof. A fire followed. 11 people died, 6 adults and 5 children. The fire destroyed the MOVE house and spread through the block, leaving dozens of neighboring homes damaged or destroyed and hundreds of residents displaced. The city's own investigation later criticized the decision to drop the bomb and the failure to control the fire. Stand at a respectful public location and do not trespass, photograph private residents without permission, or treat the block as a spectacle. The power of this place is in its ordinariness. Row houses are made for domestic life, sleep, meals, school, arguments, celebrations, and the small routines that make a place home. Aerial images can flatten that reality into a smoking outline. Being on the street restores the scale of doors, windows, stoops, and neighboring walls. It also reminds us that the victims were not only the people inside the MOVE house. The surrounding residents lost homes, possessions, photographs, community stability, and trust in the city that was supposed to protect them. The later history is also part of the stop. Survivors and families pursued legal and political accountability. The city, universities, museums, and courts have continued to debate the handling of evidence and remains. In 2022, independent reports commissioned by Philadelphia examined the history and handling of remains from the bombing and recommended corrections to death certificates. This is not a story with a clean ending. It is a place where memory, grief, responsibility, and redevelopment remain active. Say the date aloud, remember the 11 people, and let the silence do some of the work. Then move toward Cobbs Creek Park, where the route considers fire, landscape, and the aftermath carried by the neighborhood. Use Cobbs Creek Park as a place to process the route rather than as a claim that the park itself contains every part of the 1985 event. The bombing's fire and its aftermath changed the physical and emotional landscape of West Philadelphia. Homes were destroyed, families were displaced, and residents had to carry grief through ordinary streets, schools, workplaces, businesses, and public spaces. A park gives that grief a different setting. It offers distance from the house without allowing the story to disappear. As you look toward the creek, trees, paths, and open space, think about what landscapes can hold. They can hold recreation and danger, childhood and mourning, environmental memory and redevelopment. Move's philosophy placed nature and life at the center of its beliefs, while the city often treated the organization through the language of disorder and threat. Holding those ideas together is difficult, but it is part of honest historical work. The state did not simply confront an abstract ideology. It acted against people living in a neighborhood. At the same time, Move was not simply a symbol of innocence, its relationships with neighbors and its confrontations with police were real and sometimes painful. A memorial route should not resolve that complexity by choosing a single convenient sentence. It should make room for evidence, harm, responsibility, and the possibility of learning. The official investigations, survivor testimony, neighborhood memory, court records, museum exhibits, and community stories all form part of the archive. Some evidence is direct. Some is contested. Some was mishandled or lost. That is why careful language matters. End by reviewing the route sequence, government power at the Municipal Services Building, Black historical interpretation at AMP, the earlier conflict in Powelton Village, community survival at Chef Kurtz, the homes and victims of Osage Avenue, and this space for reflection. The lasting question is not only what happened in 1985. It is what a city chooses to do with the truth afterward.